Detective Emily Carter stood by the desk, the cold case file in her hands. She hadn't expected to see this name again, not after so many years. The case had been cold for over 2 decades. But here it was, a fresh lead, a single scrap of evidence that had gone unnoticed. The room felt oddly still as she turned the file over, tracing the name with her fingers. This wasn't just any case. It was personal. She had failed the victim once, and now it seemed fate had given her another chance. Emily knew this could either redeem her or ruin her completely. As she opened the file, her eyes landed on an old photograph. It was grainy, but the image was clear enough, the victim smiling with someone who was still very much alive. Emily's breath caught. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about truth. The truth that had been buried for far too long. She needed answers, and she was going to get them, no matter the cost. Detective Emily Carter sat at her desk, the cold case file now fully open in front of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the evidence in her hands was leading her somewhere important. The photograph of the victim with the man, someone still alive, was a lead she couldn't ignore. Emily had been working in the department for over a decade, but this case, this one felt different. Her eyes scanned the victim's background, realizing that there were pieces to this puzzle that had been ignored. The clues were right there. She knew that reopening the case meant a world of complications. The victim's family was still in mourning, and the case had been closed for years. Still, Emily couldn't deny the connection she felt. It wasn't just about the case, it was personal. The victim's death had haunted her for years, and she had failed to find justice. But now, Emily had to go back. She had to face her own ghosts if she was ever going to find closure, for herself and for the victim. Without a second thought, she reached for her phone. It was time to get answers. Emily dialed Officer Jake Wilson's number, her fingers lingering for a moment before pressing the call button. Jake had been a reliable partner over the years, even though he had his reservations about reopening old cases. But Emily knew that she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who understood the stakes, someone who would support her no matter how dark the path ahead became. When Jake answered, Emily wasted no time. "Jake, we need to talk. I'm reopening the Bennett case. Something doesn't feel right." There was a pause on the other end before Jake's voice came through, laced with concern. "Are you sure about this, Emily? You know how this ended last time. There's a reason it's a cold case." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm sure. I know you're not one for digging up the past, but I need your help on this one." She could hear the hesitation in Jake's voice before he finally agreed. "All right, I'll meet you at the office in an hour. But I'm telling you, this is going to stir things up." Emily sighed. "I know, but we need to know the truth." She hung up, her resolve steeling as she prepared herself for the investigation that would change everything. Emily and Jake arrived at the abandoned house where the victim had been found all those years ago. The house had stood untouched for decades, its peeling paint and broken windows a silent testament to the tragedy that had unfolded within. Emily stepped out of the car, the chill of the evening air hitting her face. It felt like stepping back in time. She hadn't been here since the case had first been closed. The memories of that night flooded back, the confusion, the unanswered questions, the guilt. As she walked towards the front door, she could almost hear the echoes of the past. "This place hasn't changed a bit," Jake remarked, his voice laced with discomfort. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the door. "It hasn't, but something here still feels wrong, Jake. I can feel it." Together, they stepped inside, the creaking floorboards the only sound as they ventured into the dimly lit interior. Every step brought them closer to a truth that had been buried for far too long. Back in the office, Emily spread out the photographs and documents across the desk, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of the victim's life. Her fingers traced the edges of the photographs, now more than 2 decades old. She had to understand who the victim had been, why her death had been left unexamined for so long. Emily found a journal entry hidden among the old files. It was the victim's handwriting, scrawled in the margins of a photograph. The words were cryptic but revealing. I fear he's watching me. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the page. Case was about to take a turn. As she read the entry aloud to herself, Jake stood in the doorway, watching her closely. What did you find? He asked, his tone cautious. Emily looked up from the journal. A confession or a warning? This isn't just about a murder. This is about someone who wanted to keep a secret, and we're about to find out who. Detective Emily Carter stood in front of the Bennett family's home, the weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders. The house, a modest two-story, sat quietly in a neighborhood that hadn't seen much change in years. She had interviewed many families before, but there was something different about this one. The victim's mother, Mrs. Bennett, had always been distant in her memories, reluctant to talk. Emily could sense the wall she had built around herself. As Emily stepped inside, she was met with the soft scent of roses that filled the living room. Mrs. Bennett, an older woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. Emily took a seat across from her, keeping a respectful distance. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about your daughter, Emily began softly. Mrs. Bennett looked away, her lips pressed into a tight line. You didn't care about her when she was alive. Why now? Emily's heart sank, but she didn't let the cold words deter her. Because she deserves justice, Mrs. Bennett, Emily replied, her voice steady. She deserves to be remembered for more than just her death. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Mrs. Bennett spoke again, her voice low and trembling. If you really want to know what happened to my daughter, you need to look closer at the people she trusted most. Emily's stomach churned. This wasn't going to be easy. Emily's investigation led her to Thomas Decker, a man in his early 40s who had been close to the victim. He was an enigmatic figure, someone who seemed to blend seamlessly into the background of the town, but Emily knew there was more beneath the surface. She had received a tip that he had been seen arguing with the victim just days before her death. Emily arrived at Thomas's apartment, a run-down building on the edge of town. The air outside was heavy with humidity, and the sky threatened rain. Emily knocked on the door, her heart racing with the anticipation of what she might find. Thomas opened the door, his face expressionless, his eyes dark and unreadable. Detective Carter, he said coolly, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was sparsely furnished, the air thick with the smell of cigarettes. I know why you're here, he said, leaning against the wall. Emily didn't hesitate. I need to know what happened the night she died, Thomas. You were the last person to see her. His lips curled into a tight smile. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied, his voice low and steady. But Emily could see it in his eyes. He was hiding something. I think you do, she said firmly, stepping closer. And I'm going to find out. As the investigation unfolded, Emily's obsession with the case grew. She spent long nights poring over the evidence, reliving every detail of the victim's life. Jake, her longtime friend and colleague, was growing concerned. Emily, you're going too deep into this, Jake said one evening, his voice tinged with worry. They sat in Emily's office, surrounded by photos and notes from the case. You're not just solving a murder, you're reopening wounds that should stay closed. Emily didn't look up from the photograph she was holding. You? I'm not going to let it go, Jake, she replied, her voice firm. If I don't find out what happened, then no one will, and she'll be forgotten. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his concern growing. I get it, but you're letting this consume you. What about your life? What about us? Emily finally looked at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and determination. There is no uses until I solve this, Jake, she said quietly. And I'm not stopping until I do. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a woman named Claire approached Emily. Claire had been a neighbor to the victim, living a few doors down from the Bennett house. She had always kept to herself, and the police had never considered her a key witness. But now, years later, Claire was ready to speak up. Emily met her in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Claire, in her late 30s, looked nervous, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her cup. I saw something, Claire whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might hear. "The night she died, I saw a man leave the house. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a jacket. But he wasn't alone." Claire hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "There was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. They were both in a hurry." Emily leaned in, her voice calm but urgent. "Tell me everything you saw, Claire. Every detail." Claire took a deep breath and began to explain. This was the break Emily had been waiting for. Emily spent the next few days following Claire's lead. She retraced the steps of the man Claire had seen, and with each passing hour, the connections began to reveal themselves. The man Claire described matched a suspect from another case, a man with ties to the local underground scene, someone whose name had been linked to shady dealings for years. Emily's heart raced as she connected the dots. "It's all coming together," she muttered to herself. But as she pieced the puzzle together, she realized that this case was more complicated than she had anticipated. The people involved were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Emily's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jake. "You're getting too close, Emily," he warned. "They'll come for you if you keep digging." Emily stared at the phone, conflicted. But she knew what she had to do. "I'm not stopping now," she said firmly, hanging up. The stakes had just gotten higher. Detective Emily Carter stood in front of Detective James Harper's office, her heart racing. She had uncovered something disturbing, a piece of evidence linking him to the case. Harper had been a trusted colleague, but now, she wasn't sure who he truly was. Emily had always admired him, his dedication to the force, his sharp instincts. But now, all of that was clouded by suspicion. As she knocked on his door, the tension was almost palpable. "Come in," Harper's deep voice called from inside. Emily entered cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. "Harper, we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What about?" Emily placed a file on his desk, the evidence inside it damning. "This." She let the silence hang in the air, letting him see the gravity of what she had found. Harper's face stiffened, but he didn't speak. Emily pressed on. "You were involved in the Bennett case, weren't you? I have proof." For a moment, Harper said nothing. Then, with a strained smile, he leaned back in his chair. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Emily." His voice had lost its usual calm. It was laced with something darker. "You're making a huge mistake." Emily took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll find out the truth no matter who it leads me to." As the investigation deepened, Jake could no longer stay silent. He had known Emily for years, and he could tell that something was off. The closer she got to the truth, the more distant she became. One evening, after another long day of digging through evidence, Jake finally confronted her. "Emily, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. They were sitting in her office, the only light coming from the desk lamp that illuminated the room. "You've been obsessing over this case, and it's starting to take its toll. You're not thinking clearly." Emily didn't look up from the pile of case files. "I'm fine, Jake. I just need to keep going. You don't understand. This is bigger than just a murder. This is about everything I've failed to fix." Jake's face softened, but his voice remained firm. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you, Emily. But you can't let this case eat you up." Emily's eyes flicked to him, her expression softening for just a moment. "I don't have a choice, Jake. If I don't solve this, I'll never be able to live with myself." The weight of her words hung in the air. Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Then you'll burn out before you ever get to the truth." The moment Emily discovered the link between the victim and a local politician, her breath caught in her throat. It was the breakthrough she had been searching for, an unexpected twist that turned the investigation on its head. As she examined the documents she had just found, the connections were undeniable. The politician, Gregory Collins, had been in contact with the victim shortly before her death. The more Emily looked into it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a murder. It was part of a much larger web of corruption. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been so focused on the obvious suspects that she had overlooked the most dangerous one of all. Emily stared at the computer screen in disbelief, her hands trembling as she dug deeper into the connection. The case had gone from being about one death to something far more sinister. She had no idea how deep the corruption ran, but she knew she had to follow this thread to its end. "This changes everything," she whispered to herself, the weight of the truth beginning to sink in. The confrontation with Gregory Collins was inevitable. Emily knew he had something to hide, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook. She had arranged to meet him at his office, a sleek, modern building that stood in stark contrast to the rundown neighborhoods she had visited. Collins greeted her with a polite smile, his perfectly pressed suit and confident demeanor masking the unease that lurked beneath the surface. "Detective Carter," he said, extending a hand. "I was wondering when you'd come around." Emily didn't shake his hand. "We need to talk about your connection to the Bennett case," she said, her voice cold. Collins' smile faltered, but only for a second. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emily leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "I have the evidence, Collins. You knew her, and I know you had something to do with her death." Collins' face turned hard, and for the first time, the mask slipped. "You're playing a dangerous game, detective," he said, his voice low and threatening. Emily stood her ground. "I'm not afraid of you." The tension in the room was thick, and Emily knew this was just the beginning. As Emily dug deeper into Collins' past, she uncovered the motive behind the murder. It wasn't just a matter of power, it was personal. Collins had been involved in a series of illegal dealings, and the victim had known too much. She had become a threat to his empire. Emily sat at her desk, reviewing the final pieces of evidence. The more she learned, the more disgusted she became. The victim had been blackmailing Collins, threatening to expose his criminal activities. When Collins realized she would not back down, he decided to silence her permanently. Emily slammed the file shut, her fists clenched in anger. "This isn't just murder," she muttered to herself. "This is execution." But even with this revelation, the case was far from over. There were still questions that needed answering, and Emily knew she couldn't stop until she had exposed the entire truth. The stakes had never been higher, and she was now in the fight of her life. The final confrontation had arrived. Emily stood face to face with Gregory Collins in a small, dimly lit room, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Collins had always appeared calm, collected, until now. His mask was slipping. He had thought he could silence her with his power, but Emily had unraveled his lies piece by piece. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Emily's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of frustration. Collins' face twisted with rage as he stepped forward. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. Emily remained unfazed, her eyes locked onto his. "I know everything, Collins. The victim was your leverage. And now, I'm going to make sure you pay for what you did." Collins scoffed, his face reddening. "You think you've won? This is far from over." But Emily's expression hardened. "It's over, Collins. You're done." The room seemed to close in on them as Emily's words sank in. Collins was finally facing justice, and nothing would stop Emily from seeing it through. After her confrontation with Collins, Emily felt the weight of the case crushing down on her. She needed to return to the crime scene. There was something about it. The eerie silence, the way the house still held the victim's presence. It was as if the house itself was begging for justice. As Emily stepped inside, she was transported back to the night of the murder. The floorboards creaked under her feet, the same way they had years ago. She could almost hear the victim's final screams echoing in the air. The house was just as dilapidated as it had been before. Overgrown vines snaked up the walls, and dust hung thick in the air. Emily moved carefully through the rooms, her eyes scanning every inch for something she might have missed. A new sense of urgency filled her as she walked into the victim's bedroom. The wallpaper, peeling with age, still had traces of the victim's life. She crouched down, inspecting the floor, her heart racing as she noticed a small blood-stained piece of fabric. "This is it," Emily whispered to herself. The last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. As the case drew closer to its conclusion, Emily uncovered a chilling revelation. Colin's past was riddled with darkness. He had been involved in multiple corrupt activities, all hidden beneath layers of lies and influence. But one piece of information stood out. Collins had been involved with organized crime long before the murder. It explained so much: why the victim was targeted, why he had been so desperate to keep her silent. Emily sat at her desk, sorting through a pile of documents. The more she read, the more disturbed she became. Collins had used his political connections to cover up his criminal dealings. He had used the victim to shield himself from a dangerous enemy, and when she became a liability, he had ordered her death. "You're nothing but a coward, Collins," Emily muttered, slamming the file shut. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Everything was coming together, and the truth was finally within her grasp. But one question remained: how far was Collins willing to go to protect himself? The deeper Emily delved into the case, the more her past resurfaced. Memories she had long buried began to surface, and she realized how much this case was mirroring her own personal failures. She had failed someone once, someone she couldn't save, and now the victim's face haunted her. The guilt gnawed at her, forcing her to confront the demons she had long tried to forget. Emily stood in front of the mirror in her office, staring at her reflection. "You're not just doing this for her," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're doing this for yourself." Her hands clenched into fists, the weight of everything pressing down on her. This wasn't just about justice for the victim anymore. It was about redemption, for herself, for the people she had failed, and for the darkness that had consumed her. Emily took a deep breath and wiped away the tears that had welled up in her eyes. The case wasn't over. Not yet. And she wasn't about to stop until she had all the answers. Emily knew the final confrontation was coming. Collins had nowhere left to run, and he knew it. But she wasn't prepared for the lengths he would go to in order to escape justice. The night before the trial, Emily received an anonymous tip. Collins was planning to flee the country, and if she didn't act fast, he would slip away into the shadows forever. She rushed to the airport, her heart pounding in her chest. As she entered the terminal, she spotted him, Collins, dressed in dark clothes, trying to blend into the crowd. Emily's mind raced. This was it. She had to stop him. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes fixed on him. "Collins!" she shouted. His head snapped toward her, and for a split second, fear flickered in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, and with a cold, calculating smile, he turned to run. Emily chased after him, determination flooding her veins. She wouldn't let him get away. Not now, not after everything he had done. In a final burst of speed, she tackled him to the ground. "You're done," Emily said, her voice firm. "You'll never run again." The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Emily sat alone in her office, the truth weighing heavily on her shoulders. Collins was guilty, not just of murder but of orchestrating a network of corruption that reached into the very heart of the city's political system. It all made sense now. The victim had been a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond what Emily had initially thought. She closed her eyes, feeling the sting of betrayal run deep. Her years of investigation had led her here, but it hadn't been easy. There were moments when she questioned herself, when the doubt crept in. But now, with everything laid out before her, Emily understood. The case wasn't just about the victim anymore. It was about exposing the web of deceit that had been hidden for so long. She had always believed in justice, but now it felt like something more personal. Her drive wasn't just for the truth, it was for redemption. The victim's death had finally served a purpose. Emily had done everything she could to find the truth. And now, it was time for the world to know what had been hidden for so long. She stood up, a sense of finality in her movements. "It's over," she whispered to herself. Emily stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the city below. It was late, and the streets were quiet, the world unaware of the storm that had just been uncovered. The case had taken everything from her, her sleep, her peace of mind, and in many ways, her sense of self. But now, standing there, she finally felt a sense of closure. The victim had been more than just a name in a file. She was a person, with hopes, dreams, and a story that had been cut short. Emily had never imagined that this case would become so personal, but it had. In a way, solving it had become her redemption. She had spent so many years haunted by her past failures that she hadn't realized how much this case was shaping her future. The realization hit her hard. This was not just about solving a murder. It was about healing the wounds she had carried with her for so long. With one last deep breath, Emily turned away from the window, her resolve stronger than ever. "Justice has been done," she whispered, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. The day of the trial had arrived. Emily walked into the courtroom, her heart beating heavily in her chest. This was it, the moment where everything would come to light. Gregory Collins sat in the defendant's chair, his once confident demeanor now a shadow of its former self. His face was pale, his eyes flickering with anxiety as the gravity of the situation settled in. Emily had always known he was guilty, but now, the court would confirm it for the world. As the trial proceeded, Emily sat silently, watching every word, every piece of evidence being presented. Collins' defense was weak, filled with lies and half-truths. But Emily knew it was only a matter of time before the truth prevailed. When it was finally her turn to speak, Emily stood and approached the witness stand. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she laid out everything she had uncovered. "Gregory Collins," she said, her voice strong, "used his power to control, manipulate, and ultimately, murder. And today we will make sure he faces the consequences." The room was silent as the weight of her words sank in. The truth had finally been spoken. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. Emily sat in her office, staring at the final documents, her mind racing with a mix of emotions. Collins had been convicted of murder, and a string of other crimes. It was a victory for justice, but it didn't feel like enough. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to relax, to let the tension ebb away. But she knew that this was only the beginning. This had changed her. It had forced her to face her past, her fears, and her own sense of self-worth. She had come to realize that solving this case was about more than just catching a criminal. It was about understanding who she was and what she stood for. She had fought for justice, and now she was finally at peace. As she sat back in her chair, she smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I did it," she whispered to herself. "I made it right." With the case closed, Emily took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She stood on the rooftop of the police building, looking out over the city. The weight of the case had been lifted, but she knew that the journey had changed her. She had faced the darkest corners of her soul, confronted her own demons, and come out stronger on the other side. As the wind blew through her hair, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "It's over," she whispered to herself, the words carrying a sense of finality. She had fought for justice, for redemption, and for herself. And now, she could finally let go. The city sprawled out beneath her, the lights twinkling like stars. Everything was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt at ease. She turned away from the edge of the rooftop and walked back into the building, ready to face whatever came next. Emily stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, her heart racing. Gregory Collins, the man responsible for so much pain, stood just ahead, unaware of her presence. The confrontation was inevitable, but now, she was ready. She had uncovered every lie, pieced together every clue. "You think you've won, don't you?" Collins sneered, turning to face her. Emily's voice was calm but firm. "I don't need to win, Collins. The truth has already won." He was no longer the man in control. His empire was falling. He took a step back, his eyes betraying his fear. "You're finished." Emily's words rang in the quiet room, the final judgment hanging in the air. Collins' face twisted in anger as he stepped closer to Emily. "You have no idea what you're up against," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. Emily took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I know exactly what you are, Collins," she replied, her voice calm. You're a coward who hides behind lies and manipulation. But not anymore. He sneered, stepping back as if to regain control. This city belongs to me. You'll regret this, Carter. Emily shook her head, her expression hardening. No, it's over. You're not in control anymore. His bravado slipped as he realized she was right. The truth had come for him. Emily's voice cut through the tension. You're not going to get away with this, Collins, she said, her words firm and resolute. Collins looked around, panic setting in. There was no escape. I've seen everything you've done, Emily continued, her eyes locking onto his. Your lies, your manipulation, your corruption. It all ends now. Collins' face twisted with frustration. You don't know what you're dealing with, he snarled. Emily's gaze never wavered. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, she replied. You've tried to silence everyone but not me. This ends today. His mask of arrogance shattered, revealing the coward he truly was. He was finished. As the police arrived, Emily watched from a distance, her chest heavy with both relief and exhaustion. Collins was finally being led away, handcuffed and surrounded by officers. Emily had seen criminals brought to justice before, but this was different. This case had consumed her, haunted her, and now it was over. She had given everything to solve it. Jake approached her quietly, offering a silent acknowledgement of her victory. You did it, Emily, he said, his voice soft. She nodded, her eyes fixed on Collins as he was escorted out. It's over, she whispered, the weight of the case finally lifting off her shoulders. But even in this moment of victory, she felt the emptiness of everything that had been lost along the way. Days later, Emily found herself standing on the rooftop of the police building, looking out over the city. The case had been closed, Collins was in custody, and justice had been served. But the city below seemed unchanged, as if nothing had shifted. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the wind brush past her. It was over, but the echoes of it would stay with her. She had fought hard, but in the end, she realized that victory came at a cost. I did what I had to do, she whispered. But it's time to move on. There was a world out there beyond this case, and Emily knew it was time to embrace it, to start anew. Her journey wasn't finished, it was just beginning. Emily sat by her window, gazing at the city below. The case was closed, but the silence felt heavy. She had uncovered the truth, but it didn't bring peace. I did what I had to do, she whispered, but even the words felt hollow. Was it worth the cost? The faces, the lies, they haunted her. The truth had been revealed, but at what personal cost? The victory seemed distant. She didn't feel like a hero, she just felt tired. Maybe it's time to move on, she thought. The case had taken its toll. Emily sat in her office, surrounded by files and photographs. The justice served felt like a distant victory. I did the right thing, she thought, but doubt lingered. The late nights, the pressure, the obsession, it had consumed her. Was it worth the sacrifices? As the room seemed to close in on her, Emily felt the weight of it all. The city outside seemed so far away now. I need to let go, she whispered. But I don't know how. Jake sat across from Emily at a bar, his concern clear. You okay? He asked gently. Emily forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, it's just hard. I've spent so long chasing this, but now that it's over, it feels empty, she said. Jake's voice softened. You don't have to do this alone. Emily looked at him, gratitude in her eyes. Maybe it's time to move forward, but I don't know how yet. Jake nodded, his hand resting on hers in support. Weeks passed, and Emily felt the weight of the case slowly lifting. She wandered through the city, reflecting on everything that had happened. I can't stay stuck in the past, she thought. She stopped at a park bench, taking a moment to sit and breathe. I've done all I can, she whispered to herself. Now it's time to let go. She realized she couldn't keep chasing ghosts. It was time to embrace what was next. I can move forward, Emily said softly, standing up. Standing on the rooftop, Emily looked at the city, feeling a sense of peace. It's over, she whispered. The case was behind her, And now she was ready to begin again. The journey had changed her, and she wasn't sure who she was anymore. But she was ready to find out. She turned away from the edge, the wind brushing against her face. "I've done what I needed to do, now I can move on," she said softly, stepping away with a sense of finality.